Well, thank you very much for joining our morning tea, April morning tea talk to everyone who is out there. My name is Claire Johnson. I am the Director of the Palliative Aged Care Outcomes Program, and today we are going to talk about benchmarking. Would you like to put up our slides, please, Laura? Thank you.
They're up for you, Claire.
Terrific, thank you, because I can't see them, that's all. Terrific, thank you. Just changing my view. Next slide, Laura. So, I know you are all meeting from around Australia, but this presentation is coming to you from the University of Wollongong, where we are meeting and working on the land of the Dharawal people. So we would like to acknowledge the Dharawal people as the traditional owners and custodians of the land in this area, but also to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional custodians and cultural knowledge holders of the lands where we are all working and meeting today. So thank you very much. Just before we move forward, I would like to introduce Alana Connolly. Now, some of you will know Alana as our statistician from PACOP. And today, Alana is our expert on benchmarking. And of course, Laura is in the background and Zoe is in the background helping us. Now, some of you will know Laura as our improvement facilitator for New South Wales and Victoria and Tasmania, and Zoe is our admin person who helps everyone get here on time. First slide. So just as a bit of a background, for those who are very new to us and for those who need a little bit of background, PACOP is an outcomes program. It's funded by the national program funded by the Australian Government Department of Health and Aged Care. And in our talks that we have done with many aged care organisations, we talk about PACOP as being an opportunity for quality improvement for organisations in the care that they provide for individuals at the bedside, but also as an opportunity for improving the care that is embedded into each aged care home. And part of that process is this benchmarking program that we have been talking about. So while PACOP's primary objective is to systematically improve residents' palliative aged care outcomes, including pain and other symptoms, and that is applied to an individual at the bedside, the bigger picture is that we want to improve what you are doing in an individual aged care homes within your organisation. And the larger picture is for us to be able to improve and to be able to see what's happening in changing the way we provide palliative and end-of-life care in aged care homes more broadly across Australia. A central part of the PACOP program is our assessment, respond and plan protocol, and it talks about routine clinical assessments, how we should respond to certain criteria that are identified in that individual assessments, and planning the individual care for the resident. But working in parallel to this means the information that is collected from those individual resident assessments can be captured, and it has clinical meaning in terms of being able to look at how well each aged care home is performing, and provides the opportunity to compare that performance against how they have been performing historically, how their individual aged care home is performing against other aged care homes within their organisation or within their area, and nationally. Of course, we understand that that is your data and your own information only is ever identified back to you. It then goes into this large data set which we can use as a comparison for all aged care homes in Australia. So it provides the aged care homes with that opportunity to see what they are doing really well, but also seeing how the aged care is performing against the aged care homes right across Australia. But the other point of benchmarking is to be able to identify a standard that has clinical meaningful standard, which the aged care homes can work towards. Part of PACOP is that benchmarking program. So in PACOP, we know that you will know that there are assessment tools that we use on a regular time points in the profile collection, and then if a resident needs palliative care, then they are assessed much more regularly using the outcomes collection. It provides the opportunity to define that clinical language, and the items that we have used in the assessment framework have very clear definitions, but also facilitates that collection of nationally consistent palliative care information. So when we talk about that being a standardised process, that standardised assessments, it means that when your information is being compared to another aged care organisation, all aged care homes in Australia, we can be confident that everybody is assessing their residents and the information is consistent. In our assessment framework, we have 6 validated clinical assessment tools: the PACOP SAS, the Palliative Care Problem Severity Score, the Australian Modified Karnofsky Performance Status, the Resource Utilisation Activities of Daily Living, or RUG-ADL, and the Rockwood Clinical Frailty Scale. And these provide an opportunity for us to be looking at how and comparing how aged care homes are performing. But we also have added some really other important psychosocial questions that can be used to compare. Next slide. So when we're talking about broad definitions of benchmarking, the concept of benchmarking is around the search for best industry practice, which leads to exceptional performance. And through that, being able to implement those best practices throughout the industry. So the key themes are around things like measurement. How do we measure in a consistent way? How do we compare in a way that's meaningful? How do we identify what is best practice? And how do we use that information to implement and to improve? So it's identifying, understanding, and adapting and identifying those outstanding practices and being able to share them right across Australia. So being able to identify those high performance models of care and to be able to help aged care homes and the industry to share that information. I want to go through for next slide. So really, you can't fix what you don't know. And that is the idea of being able to receive reports back about what an aged care home is doing. So benchmarks seek to help aged care homes know where they sit in relation to important clinical and process related outcome measures or measures. So it drives progress to gather progress around really high quality performance rather than just average end of life care. So we're talking about the comparison that can happen right around Australia. And because of that, we are aiming to drive that improvement, national improvement. PACOP has been working to help aged care homes understand the assessments and to embed those into routine practice. And our next part of the development of PACOP as a whole is to develop the specific benchmarks, which Alana is going to talk about in a little bit more detail. And in fact, we've started talking to aged care homes about what those benchmarks might look like. Next slide. So I've been talking a lot about benchmarks and comparison. In the reports, when we have developed benchmarks, this might be what some of the information that will look like that comes back to you. Now, we've borrowed this slide from another outcome centre at the University of Wollongong called EPOC, and they look at pain over time for people with chronic pain. And this specific benchmark is talking about the percentage of patients reporting moderate or worse pain at the end of their episode than they had at the beginning of their episode. So this isn't a palliative care slide. This is about another service, and it's looking at pain. And as you can see in the graph on the left-hand side, the specific service that this report would have gone back to is reporting that 28.6% of their patients who had moderate or severe pain at the beginning of their episode of care had improved by the end of it. The grey, the blue bit in the background, the wave diagram, shows all of the pain services who are participating in EPOC and how they are performing. So as you can see right on the left-hand side of the graph, there is a pain service where 57% of their patients have made a significant clinical improvement in terms of their pain during their episode of care. If you go right down to the left-hand side of that particular graph, you can see that there is a pain service that is really struggling. Now, the red line that goes across, this is the identified benchmark that the pain services are working to. So they are trying to reach that 40% line. And when these services work together, they can talk to each other. And this 28.6% service may look at the 57% service and say, what are you doing differently to what we are doing? And can you show us the information so that we can improve what we are doing? The graph on the right-hand side, again, shows you that 40% benchmark, and it shows how this individual service has changed over time. So even though they are performing at about 28.6% now, back in 2016 and 17, they were around the same level. So they've been around this level, then they've gone down a bit, and they've improved over the last couple of years. Also, in terms of how the rest of Australia has been performing against this particular benchmark, you can see the light blue line, which shows what's happening nationally. And, while this service is not meeting the benchmarks, as a whole, the nation is still working to try and meet this benchmark. Alana, have I explained this correctly?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Claire. And as you can see, even at 40%, this is still quite a difficult benchmark to meet, simply because this is a chronic pain population and it's just very difficult. So yeah, and that's it. There's one service really struggling at 5% and then one up around 57%. So there's a lot of variation there.
And there's a great opportunity for palliative pain services to be learning from each other when in this instance. Next slide, Laura. So just quickly, in terms of feedback from the component that I've been talking about, being part of this benchmarking process provides and demonstrates that a service is willing to be flexible and to learn from other organisations. They're open to sharing their information and learning. It promotes good communication practices within aged care homes, within aged care organisations, and we're trying to promote that communication right across the sector and our willingness to be part of something that's larger than themselves, because it absolutely demonstrates that commitment to improvement and to being outward looking. Now I'm going to hand over to Alana, who's going to talk about that specific, how do we develop that red line in relation to the palliative aged care outcomes program.
Thanks, Claire. And it actually takes a lot longer to develop that red line than what you think it should. So you can see on this slide that there's the basic process for developing PACOP benchmarks, and I'm just going to go through it fairly quickly. So the first step is to identify aspects of resident care that we can measure. And they're either indicators, which is a single time point, or outcome measures, which is multiple time points. So it's just bear in mind that that's a thing. Sometimes, so for our profile collection, we're likely to have just indicators, which are single time points. So it'll be potentially things like whether we've seen the resident when they first come in, whereas outcome measures is more within the outcomes collection, where we're talking about a start and an end point. So we're talking more about if they're out of pain or having their pain decrease within a set amount of time. And then, so once we identify the aspects we want to measure, we then look at evidence that it can be improved. So that just means that it's amenable to change, and we can link it into our quality improvement processes so you can do something about it. There's nothing worse than going, oh, you're doing this badly. Hey, you're still doing it badly and we can't tell you how to fix it. So that's not useful. From there, we look at how it will be measured. This involves things like just working out the inclusion criteria, where the start and end points will be for outcome measures. We then, and at this point, we usually, it's not unusual that we'll set preliminary benchmarks, and that's just a line where we think it's going to be. This is not formal, but we do tend to set it at this point so we've got an idea of what we're thinking will happen. From there, we assess the variation between the aged care homes. So we get a bit of data in and we just start looking at it to make sure if everyone's meeting the benchmark at 95%, probably not a very good benchmark because there's no way to fix that.
The same as make it harder. We meet.
That's it. Yeah, we obviously haven't quite got that right. So we're just sort of looking at it, making sure we've got it right, refine anything that's not right. And then we start monitoring and testing for a couple of reporting periods. Now, this is important to make sure the data doesn't go up and down and up and down and up and down. It needs to be a little bit more steady, and just to get an idea of, is this going to work long term? Because there's nothing worse of it than us going, hey, we think you should do this, and then it being completely impractical and frustrating everyone. So we just take a little bit of time to make sure we get these things perfectly right.
So Alana, where are we actually up to in that process?
So we're still fairly close to the beginning of this process. We are currently looking at what we're going to measure and how we're going to measure it. We're looking at getting data in for this current reporting period. And at that point, we're going to start looking at assessing the variations. So we're sort of in the first 4 steps. And to a certain extent, we do them simultaneously because different people can do different parts of it. We do need to consult and talk to people in the sector about what our outcome measures should be, because they have a wealth of knowledge, far more knowledge than us in a lot of ways. So we look to the sector for information on whether these things will work or not.
So that leads into me just highlighting that we have a benchmarking development workshop coming up in 2 weeks, where aged care homes who are contributing data and have been using their assessments regularly are going to provide feedback to us about the ideas that we have about what the benchmarks items should be, plus what the benchmark levels should be.
That's exactly it. And so, yeah, those last couple of steps down the bottom are still quite a way away. That's where we formally set benchmarks and we implement them into our program. And that will happen, but it'll probably be 18 months or so. So we're getting there, which is very exciting. Next slide, Laura. So this slide just gives you some information about what the criteria for benchmarks are. Again, here at ASRI, we have we're the 4th outcome centre, so we've done this before. We know what works, we know what doesn't work. One of the most important things here is that we reflect good rather than average practice. So these benchmarks are aspirational. They're going to be set high. They're going to be hard, but that's because we want to inflect change through quality improvement. If we set it at 50%, then half the people meet it and go, okay, cool, my work's done here, don't need to do any more. So that is part of our job, is setting it where the top 10% of services are meeting it rather than at 50%. There's also down the bottom of that just a handful of technical things around number of observations and item completion rates. And that is just simply to make sure the data comes out fairly evenly rather than seeing swinging observations. Next slide, please, Laura. So this one we've already talked a little bit about, but this is one of our sister centres, EPOC, chronic pain. As Claire talked about, this particular service has roughly 30%. They're working towards it and they're getting there. Can we go to the next slide? This one is a PACOP benchmark, and it is for palliative care patients for our sister centre PACOP. And as you can see, this is the unstable phase, and that patients need to be outside of the unstable phase in 3 days. Now, as you can see on this graph, you've got on the left-hand side, the big blue blob, left-hand side, the ones that are meeting at the highest, and the ones on the right-hand side are meeting the lowest. Now, from memory, this is about 180 services in this graph, which is why it's a wave. If I try and put 180 lines on there, we're going to confuse everyone, and it's going to be terrible. So there's 2 dots on this graph. This is just because this is an inpatient and community service. So the inpatient is achieving 95%, which is above the benchmark, and the community service is achieving 78.4%, which is below the benchmark, which is fine. You can see on this graph that roughly about 50% of PACOP services are meeting this benchmark, which is actually pretty cool. And that's great, but this has been a benchmark for a very long time. So if Laura goes to the next slide for me, it hasn't always been the case. Now, we introduced this benchmark. Patients will be in the unstable phase for less than 3 days at 90% in 2008. Okay, we've washed out the first couple of periods, and then this is from 2010 to 2020. You can see in 2010, wasn't looking so rosy, yeah? And when we first set this benchmark, we had a lot of conversations around, is this even achievable? There's going to be cases where this isn't going to happen. This isn't going to work. And we kind of said, no, we actually want to sit it at 90%. And you can see the services are a long way below 90% there.
Why did we want to set it at 90%?
Because we truly believe that people shouldn't be in urgent need for more than 3 days. If that's your loved one, if that's someone who, if that's you, do you really want to be there and say, oh, well, they couldn't quite get around to fixing my pain in 3 days? No, if you're in severe pain, you want it fixed straight away.
So it was aspirational, but it was a really important clinical benchmark.
Yeah. And as you can see, little bit by little bit, I actually love this graph because it shows that this is real life patients. This is real life people. In 2010, only 40% of the time in the community it was going to be met. And in the inpatient, 55% of the time. Now you're sitting between 85 and 90% of the time, all the time. And this is just every service, little bit by little bit. This is not a quick process, little bit by little bit, trying to improve, trying to change things, trying to make it better. And here we are now, where most patients are in the unstable phase for less than 3 days. And that is really, really cool. So I really like this graph. And it does show that what we're doing does work. There are ways to do this. It's a slow process. It's not going to happen overnight. And so this is what we're hoping to do within PACOP 2. We'll take things that are low level and we'll work at it slowly, so that we get better outcomes for real people in aged care. Would you like to add anything to that, Claire?
No, you've captured it very well.
And
so this is, sorry.
No, you go, Claire.
No, that's it. These were just some extra ones. If anybody asks specific questions, Laura, if you want to go back to the final slide, that's great. This was just us giving you a very quick overview of benchmarking, because we use the term all the time when we are talking to aged care homes. It's our aspirational target. So we are still working through the development of all of the aspects of PACOP, and this is a really important aspect of it. The other reason that we did this was because we use this term benchmarking, and it has a number of components. Ideally, it's about reporting and the information that you get back. We also talk about benchmarking as being those opportunities for aged care homes, organisations to come together, to be able to see what each other are doing, to be able to share information, to be able to acknowledge I'm doing well and hooray, and also to acknowledge that I'm not doing so well, can you help me? So that is part of our vision moving forward, is to have a large community of practice right across Australia, really, but breaking it down into smaller ones, of course, where people can work together and help each other to improve what we are doing for our residents. Thank you everyone for being part of the morning tea talk today. If people have questions, please feel free to email them into us, and we will respond, of course, using our PACOP at uow.edu.au email. Thank you very much. And thank you, Alana and Laura and Zoe, for your help.
Thank you, everybody, for coming and joining us this morning. Our next morning tea talk will be on palliative care and the ANAC for our residents. And so we'll have the event registration link live shortly, and you'll be able to register for